Good day. This programme is taking place on Friday the 20th of January, even as defence ministers of around 50 Western aligned countries are meeting at the German airbase in Ramstein, where they're apparently having discussions about whether or not to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine and what form those heavy weapons will be. And that's perhaps a slight misstatement of the position because, as I'm going to discuss later in this programme, what it all really amounts to is a demand that Germany, for some reason, should agree to supply its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, both from its own stocks and by allowing the re-export of its tanks by other countries which have been supplied with them. Now, I'm going to come to this discussion, to this issue later in this programme. All I would say for the moment is that as of the time of the making of this video, there's been no decision, or at least no reported decision, which has yet been made about Leopard 2 tank deliveries to Ukraine. And obviously, probably by the time this video goes out, such a decision will have been announced one way or the other. So anything that I say over the course of this video should be regarded as very provisional. But first of all, before we do that, let's talk about, as we traditionally do, the military situation on the battlefronts. And one of the interesting developments that has now taken place is that even as the hard slog in and around Bakhmut and Soledar and Siversk continues, the Russian military have perhaps taken advantage of Ukraine's distraction by the events in Bakhmut, its over-concentration of its forces in and around Bakhmut, to launch its own offensive in Zaporozhye region. Now, this is an area where there were lots of speculations a few weeks ago, to some extent even still, that Ukraine was thinking of launching its own offensive towards Melitopol, or some people suggested Mariupol, to try to cut the Russian land corridor to Crimea and to break through all the way to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. Well, for the moment, there's been no such Ukrainian offensive, but some kind of offensive by the Russians is underway. And this morning, we got reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense that a village called Lobkovo had been captured from the Ukrainians by the Russian military, and that heights in the direction of Orechov, Gulyai, Polye, and Kamensky have also been captured by the Russian military, and that various settlements, villages and hamlets and such things in and around a town called Orechov have also come under Russian fire control. In other words, they can be fired at. They're within range of medium range, and perhaps even shorter range Russian artillery guns. And an official of the Zaporozhye government, the Russian-backed, I should stress, Russia-installed Zaporozhye government, a person called Vladimir Rogov, has now said that the town of Orechov itself looks like it might soon be encircled. And TASS reports him as saying the following: if it continues this way, Orechov may find itself in operational encirclement, and TASS points out that Orechov is about 60 kilometers away from the region's administrative center, which is the city of Zaporozhye. And I should say that there were reports a few days ago, reports that I don't consider terribly reliable, but for what they were circulating, that the Ukrainians are now taking steps to prepare defenses in Zaporozhye city itself. Zaporozhye had a pre-war population of around 750,000. Some months ago, I heard that, or rather I read, that this had declined to about 400,000, but obviously it's a much bigger place than any of the cities that have been contested up to now. Mariupol, Kherson, whatever. Bakhmut, Zaporozhye is one of the sort of major industrial hubs of Ukraine, and certainly its loss, were it to happen, would be a major blow for Ukraine. But anyway, we're perhaps getting ahead of ourselves. Orekhov, even Orekhov, a much smaller place, obviously has not been encircled, much less captured yet, but it does look as if the Russians are making some kind of advance in this area. We don't yet know how big that offensive is going to be, and nor do we know, by the way, whether it is connected in some way with operations further east in Vuhledar, along the roads from Zaporozhye to Ukrainian positions opposite Donetsk city. It might be that these are all connected to those things in some shape or form. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin, a US military officer who has written some extremely insightful and astute pieces about the Ukrainian war, pointing out about how industrial warfare has returned, he suggested that the most likely route for a Russian offensive would be from Zaporozhye, through Zaporozhye region, to cut off the supply routes to the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And perhaps, just possibly, what we're seeing is the start of that. Now, I don't want to push this too far. As I said, we mustn't get ahead of ourselves, but that does seem to be the situation. At the moment, the Russians are making some kind of advance in Zaporozhye. They've gained some ground. They're advancing towards a place called Orekhov, and we'll see what they do and how the Ukrainians respond. Meanwhile, on the other major battlefront, which is Bakhmut, Siversk, the fighting goes on. There's still no sign of any Ukrainian withdrawal either from Siversk or Bakhmut, but a Russian, or rather, actually, he's Chechen official who is connected to the Ukrainian-controlled, rather Russian-controlled government of the Lugansk People's Republic, has this to say about the situation in Bakhmut itself. He says, our units, and his name, by the way, is Apti Alaudinov, and he's the deputy commander of the 2nd Army Corps of the Lugansk People's Militia, but as I said, he's actually a Chechen. Anyway, this is what he has to say. Our units, forces and means, first of all, the Wagner private military company and units of the Russian Ministry of Defense operating in this area indeed bring very good results. Although we can see on the map that Klesheyevka is in fact a very small piece of land. That's Klesheyevska, the village that was captured by the Russians, or at least whose capture they confirmed yesterday. The fact is that strategically, even this piece of land is very important. And Alaouddin added, and this is all from TASS, that the daily advance of our forces and means leads to the situation in which we can probably already say that in principle, Artyomovsk, that's the Russian name for Bakhmut, current Russian name for Bakhmut, is close to operational blockade, and the enemy is already pinned down from all sides. One more artery that is not under full control remains there, and I think he's clearly referring to the road leading into Bakhmut from the west through the village of Ivanovka. One more artery that is not under full control remains there, but it is also an artery that is already under operational control. Now, what he means by that, I think, is that the Russian artillery is now very close to this road that passes through Ivanovka and is able to shell the road and is able to shell any Ukrainian troops and supplies that try to enter Bakhmut through this road. So that's what this person, Alaouddin, is saying. I've not always found him, I have to say, the most reliable commentator on what is going on the battlefronts, whereas Vladimir Rogov, who was describing the situation in Zaporozhye, in the past I have found him highly reliable. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss how accurate this information by Mr. Alaouddin is, but I suspect that, again, he's got the trajectory of travel right. Overall, it does seem as if the Russians are closing in on Ivanovka. There was reports yesterday of fighting around this particular village. I'm going to guess that, given its importance, the Ukrainians will make a big fight of it. And anyway, we will see what happens. So, at the moment, we have Russian advances in Zaporozhye region, in and around Bakhmut, which is heading towards a cauldron, and towards Siversk, which on very reliable, or at least maybe not reliable, but accumulating Ukrainian sources are telling us that General Zaluzhny has advised President Zelensky to pull the troops out from, lest they find themselves in a cauldron also. Now, I'm going to just deal with a few pronunciation issues. Firstly, I said yesterday that I received an email from someone who said that the correct word was not cauldron to describe what the Russians do. That it all arose from the German Kessel, which is perhaps more accurately, well, literally a kettle. And this person suggested that boiler might be a more accurate translation. I've now had a flood of emails from various people, including several people from Russia, who tell me that the word cauldron is the correct translation after all. So I'm going to revert to the use of the word cauldron. Boiler yesterday, only time I'm going to use that expression. Cauldron again. There's someone else who's complaining once more that I'm still not getting the pronunciation of the Abrams tank exactly right. Well, I've listened to how Americans pronounce it, and I've decided that I'm not going to try to copy American pronunciation. After all, I don't speak with an American accent. I speak with an English accent. I pronounce other words in other languages according to their English pronunciation, which is mine, my English accent. I mean, I say leopard 2, for example. I don't try and give the German name, pronounce the name of this tank in a German way, nor, for what it's worth, have I ever succeeded in pronouncing properly the names of Turkey's leader and of other Turkish officials. So I'm going to give up the effort of providing an accurate American pronunciation of this particular tank. And I hope people will understand why. At the end of the day, as I said, I speak with an English accent, and well, there it is. So, moving on, what else is happening on the battlefronts? Well, as I am making this program, there's air raid alerts all across Ukraine. There's reports of a missile strike on an ammunition depot, at least the Russians say it's an ammunition depot in the city of Odessa. I'm sure that we will be getting more news over the course of the day about whether there is another big Russian missile strike underway. But this is all very preliminary at the moment, and I'm not going to try to guess as to exactly what is going on there. And I would also say that it does seem some of these air raid alerts that Ukraine has recently been making have been false alarms, and the Ukrainians link them to the exercises, the military exercises that are going on in Belarus, and in particular to the takeoff of MiG-31 fighter bombers from Belarusian airfields. Some of these either carry or are able to carry Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, and it seems that there are some people in Ukraine, when they see these aircraft take off, who worry that these MiG-31s might launch missile strikes on Ukraine itself. Well, so far, I haven't seen a huge amount of evidence of a big missile offensive by the Russians against Ukraine today, but that may change over the course of the day. And if it does, well, I'll have to discuss it tomorrow. Meanwhile, the Russians have been keeping an eye on the general situation with all this talk about armored vehicle and missile deliveries to Ukraine. And they've taken some physical precautions. Over the course of yesterday, photographs were circulating all over both the Russian and the international media, showing that the Russians have positioned Panzer air defense systems on the roof of their Ministry of Defense building in Moscow, and apparently on the roofs of some of their other key buildings. And this is quite an interesting development, actually, because it strongly suggests to me that the Russians have received some kind of a tip-off or perhaps intelligence information about Ukraine attempting some kind of missile strike on Moscow. And the missiles, the converted Strij drones that Ukraine used to carry out strikes on the Engels airbase, they apparently do have the range to carry out some kind of strike against Moscow itself. And 2 days ago, there was a rather interesting report in the New York Times, which said that the United States, the administration, is now becoming more willing to countenance Ukrainian attacks, missile attacks on Crimea, which is interesting in itself. But I suspect that the Russians read that report in the New York Times and concluded that the United States isn't just giving a green light to Ukraine to launch missile strikes in Crimea, but that they're also giving the green light for Ukraine to launch missile strikes deeper into Russia. And it may very well have been that New York Times article that might have provoked the Russian response and caused the Russians to position these Panzer systems on the roofs of these buildings. Anyway, we'll see whether Ukraine does indeed launch or try to launch any of these cruise missile strikes on Moscow. The Russians obviously want the world to see these installations. They've not made any attempt to conceal them. And I suspect that they want the world, the West in particular, to know that if attacks like that do take place, Moscow at least is defended. Anyway, moving on, the Russians have also made certain observations about the potential supply of tanks and other armoured vehicles by the West to Ukraine. And there have been some rather strong Russian statements from people like Dmitry Medvedev and the Russian ambassador, Mr. Antonov, in Washington. But perhaps the most authoritative statement comes from Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman. And this is what Peskov is reported to have said. And he said this in over a briefing today. And he said that, whilst the meeting in Ramstein is still underway, he said if there are deliveries of tanks by the West to Ukraine, the consequences will be negative, certainly. We have said multiple times that these supplies can't change anything in principle, but they will add problems for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And Peskov then is reported by TASS saying that the supplies shouldn't be overestimated from their perspective of their potential to change anything. Specialists are perfectly aware of the problems that accompany such supplies. All these tanks need maintenance, repairs, and so on, and the delivery of such machines to Ukraine would add problems for Ukraine, but wouldn't change anything in terms of the progress of the Russian side towards achieving its goals. And I think that's an authoritative statement. I think that the Russians are probably unfazed by these deliveries, if they do take place, of these Western tanks and armoured vehicles to Ukraine. Well, Western tanks, as I said, we know that 14 Challenger 2s from Britain will be supplied to Ukraine. And other armoured vehicles, well, we know France is supplying its wheeled tanks. The United States has now announced that it's providing a further 59 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, presumably in addition to the 50 that have already been announced as going to be supplied, and there'll be 90 Striker wheeled armoured vehicles as well. And of course the Germans are supplying 40 Marders, and the British are supplying around 100, I seem to remember, of their Bulldog armoured personnel carriers. And anyway, these vehicles are going to be sent, but of course the drama at the moment is around the Leopard 2 deliveries. And there's been some suggestions about French also supplying Leclerc tanks. I'll come to that later in this programme. But anyway, the Russians don't seem to be particularly alarmed about this. As far as they're concerned, these are just more tanks. Ukraine has been supplied with many other tanks, and they don't, Soviet-era tanks, they don't seem to think that these tanks and armoured vehicles are going to be much of a game changer at the end of the day. Now, I'm going to make a number of further observations about this. The first is that there is an extraordinary amount of hysteria around this issue in the West. There was apparently a rather angry exchange between Biden and Scholz over the telephone the other day. Scholz apparently said that he wasn't prepared to send Leopard 2s to Ukraine unless the United States was prepared to send its own Abrams tanks. Biden came back and said under no circumstances is the United States sending its Abrams tanks. They're too sophisticated, too complicated. The gas turbine engine is unsuitable for operation on these battlefields. There's been, over the last few hours, certainly in Britain and I think in other places, a huge concerted attempt to pressure the Germans into changing their position on Leopard 2 tank deliveries. It's clear that this move in Germany itself is unpopular. It's also encountering increasing resistance from the German army. We now have another, as I said, important German military officer, General Kuyat, coming forward and speaking out against it. I mentioned this in my video yesterday. I'm going to say more about what General Kuyat has been saying. But anyway, there's been this enormous pressure on Germany to agree to supply these Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And on top of all of that, we have had problems within Germany itself. The former German Defense Minister, Mrs. Lambrecht, has resigned after mounting criticism of her actions. We've had a new German Defense Minister, Mr. Pistorius, who's been thrown into this argument almost immediately before he's had time to really acquaint himself with the full situation and perhaps speak to the military. I wondered, by the way, whether this is simply a coincidence, whether one of the reasons why Mrs. Lambrecht resigned when she did was that she didn't want to be the defense minister who went to Ramstein. She didn't want to be involved either in the arguments and quarrels that were taking place there, or perhaps face some of the backlash from the German generals when she returned to Berlin, if she did announce that these Leopard 2 tanks would be delivered to Ukraine after all. I mean, this is purely a guess, and I might be completely wrong here. But anyway, there's been this enormous demand that there should be tanks released to Ukraine, heavy tanks, and principally and primarily they have to be Leopard 2s. And this is despite the fact that there's by general agreement Leopard 2s are not the ideal tanks for, I said general agreement, perhaps that's an overstatement. Most experts, as we will see, think that this is not the best or most suitable tank, Western tank for Ukraine, and this is presumably why it's going to be Leopard 2s that people are agitating and pushing for, and we'll see what the Germans do. I'm going to anticipate by saying that, as has consistently been the case in every red line that the Germans have set for themselves, they've always said they won't do this, they won't do that, they won't do something else. They've said in the past they won't supply Leopard 2s to Ukraine. They're now coming under enormous pressure to do so. I think they will do so, and I think we will probably get that announcement later today. But anyway, let's first of all talk about these tanks. The first is that this is another big, heavy tank. It's 70 tons. Apparently, when it's all up weight, some people have told me, by the way, that I have underestimated the weight of the Challenger 2. Apparently, it is up to 80 tons when it operates in a battle condition. I'm not certain about this, but the Leopard 2 is also a big, heavy tank. Now, the French have a much lighter tank, which is the Leclerc, and it's apparently about 55 tons, and it has an automatic loader, rather like the Russian tanks do. On the face of it, it seems closer to the kind of tanks the Ukrainians have worked with in the past, the T-64s, former Soviet tanks, much lighter than these Western tanks, and also with automatic loaders and presumably more, well, definitely better adapted to the environment. But the French, unsurprisingly, as we will see, have been very, very unwilling to supply Leclercs to Ukraine. And the reason is not actually very difficult to work out. There just aren't that many of them. France has about 400 Leclercs, but around 180 of them are in store, and they're apparently used to keep the rest of the French tank fleet supplied. So the largest number of tanks, Leclerc tanks, that France could provide to Ukraine would be, well, a dozen, a score, perhaps a bit more. But if it started to supply more of those tanks than that, well, it would start to cut in to its total arsenal of tanks. And production of the Leclerc apparently stopped in 2007. There are suggestions that it could be restarted, but realistically, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Now, there are a lot more Leopard 2s around. The Leopard 2 was a much more successful tank for export than the Leclerc. The only country that apparently bought the Leclerc in large numbers was the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. It operates the Leclerc tank, most unlikely to be prepared to supply any of its Leclerc tanks to Ukraine, by the way, if that idea is floated by anyone. But anyway, the Leopard 2, by contrast, and for whatever reason, was a big export success for Germany. I've seen varying numbers of how many of these Leopard 2s there are, but let's say there's 2,300 in various militaries. However, they come in various different forms. Some of them are in very poor condition. The tanks in the Spanish arsenal are said to be, a lot of them are said to be in particularly poor condition, unfit to be supplied to Ukraine. And it's, again, likely that the total number of tanks that could be supplied, Leopard 2 tanks, that could be supplied to Ukraine, is going to be relatively small. Now, I've seen the figure of 100 tanks in total floating around. It might be that, it might be a bit more. Brian Beletic has discussed the possibility that it might be many more. Well, we shall just have to see. But let's assume that we're talking about 1 or 2 or perhaps 300 of these things. What difference is it going to make? Well, let's discuss what General Kuyat had to say in that interview. And it is a most interesting interview. It's been given to a magazine called Zeitgeschehen im Fokus. I'm not quite sure how mainstream it is. This article suggests perhaps not especially mainstream, but General Kuyat is careful to remind us that he was the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council and of the NATO-Ukraine Commission of Chiefs of Defence. So he is clearly somebody with an expert background in military matters. And he is even more outspoken and angry about what is happening than General Vad, Merkel's military advisor, whose interview was published by John Helmer, reported by John Helmer in John Helmer's website Dancing with Bears, and which I discussed in a recent video. Well, General Kuyat makes it fairly clear that he thinks that this war is not a straightforward case of a Russian aggression against Ukraine. And he says, I have always believed, and this is from this interview, I should say I'm using what is essentially a machine translation of this interview. I've not seen any English transcript so far. I've always believed that this war should be prevented and that it could have been prevented. I made a public statement to this effect in December 2022. At the beginning of January 2022, I published proposals on how negotiations could achieve a result acceptable to all sides that would avoid war. Unfortunately, things turned out differently. Perhaps the question one day will be asked, who wanted this war and who didn't want to prevent it and who couldn't prevent it? Well, that's a pretty loaded question. You can see that General Kuyat clearly thinks that there were some people in the West, in the United States, in Britain, who most emphatically did want a war and who basically went out of their way to try to provoke it. And General Kouyat also has quite a lot to say about the sabotage of the negotiations to end the war, which were taking place in March last year in Istanbul. I found it so regrettable that the negotiations which were held in Istanbul in March were broken off after great progress and a thoroughly positive result for Ukraine. In the Istanbul negotiations, Russia apparently agreed to withdraw its armed forces to the level of February 23rd. By the way, I'm not sure that's true. Before the start of the attack on the Ukraine. Now the full withdrawal has been demanded again and again as a prerequisite for negotiations. Ukraine had to pledge to renounce NATO membership and not to permit the stationing of foreign troops or military facilities. In return, it would receive security guarantees from states of its choice. The future of the occupied territories, he means the Donbass, was to be resolved diplomatically within 15 years with the explicit renunciation of military force. And then he goes on to blame Boris Johnson for sabotaging those negotiations. And he's clearly extremely angry about this. And he's also very angry about the fact that the sabotage of the Istanbul negotiations has not been discussed in the German media. He points out that it has been discussed in the US media. He talks about the fact that it has been discussed in Foreign Affairs by Fiona Hill, by Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, and that it's even been confirmed by the Ukrainian newspaper Ukrainska Pravda. But it hasn't been discussed in the German media at all. He's also seriously worried that the way things are heading, there is a real risk of a confrontation between Russia and NATO. And then he gets to the rub. He talks about the way in which, instead of supporting its own armed forces, rebuilding its own armed forces, Germany is, despite all the rhetoric, in effect disarming itself. He said, it is obvious to everyone that as a result of the Ukraine war, the Bundeswehr continues to be disarmed, even cannibalized, in order to free weapons and military hardware for Ukraine. Some politicians even justify this with the nonsensical argument that our freedom is being defended in Ukraine. And then he's asked, why is this argument nonsensical? And he says Ukraine is fighting for its freedom, for its sovereignty, and for the territorial integrity of the country. But the two main players are Russia and the United States. Ukraine is fighting for US geopolitical interests because their declared goal is to weaken Russia politically, economically, and militarily, to such an extent that they can turn the US can turn on their geopolitical rival, the only one capable of endangering US supremacy as a world power, which is China. It would be highly immoral to leave Ukraine alone in its struggle for our freedom and merely supply weapons that prolong the bloodshed and increase the country's destruction. No, this war is not about our freedom. The core issue why this war arose still continues. And then he talks angrily again about the sabotage of the Minsk agreement. He says that it's now clear that there was a conscious sabotage of the attempts to negotiate a compromise over the Minsk agreement, but then he discusses the supply of heavy weapons of armor, artillery, and all the rest, armor to Ukraine. And he says this: weapon systems have strengths and weaknesses due to technical features, and thus, depending on the training level of the soldiers and the respecting operational framework conditions, a certain operational value. In combined arms combat, various weapon systems work together in a command and information system, where the weaknesses of one system are offset by the strengths of another. With a low level of training on the part of the operating personnel, or if a weapon system is not used together with other systems in a functional context, and the operating conditions are difficult, the operational value is low. This means that there is a risk of being knocked out prematurely, or even a risk of the weapon falling into the opponent's hands. This is the current situation in which modern Western weapon systems are being used in Ukraine. In December, Russia began an extensive program to evaluate the technical and operational tactical parameters of Western weapons, which is intended to increase the effectiveness of its own operations and Western effectiveness. In addition, there is a fundamental question of the means-end relationship. What purpose would Western weapons serve? Zelensky has repeatedly changed the strategic goals of Ukraine's warfare. Currently, Ukraine's goal is to recapture all Russian-held territories, including Crimea. The German Chancellor says we will support Ukraine as long as it is necessary, including in pursuing its goal, even though the United States has meanwhile emphasized that it is only a matter of recapturing territory which has been occupied by Russia since February 24th, 2022. By the way, I'm not sure he's right about that either. But anyway, it is therefore necessary to answer the question of whether the means of Western weapons deliveries are suitable for in fulfilling the purpose intended by Ukraine. The question has a qualitative and quantitative dimension. The United States does not supply any weapons other than those for self-defense, no weapons that would enable combined arms combat, and above all, which could trigger a nuclear escalation. And then he goes on to say, Ukraine's Chief of Staff, General Zaporozhye, has recently said, I need 300 main battle tanks, 600 to 700 armoured personnel carriers, and 500 howitzers. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, to push back the Russian troops to the positions before the February 24th attack. However, with what he has received, no major operations are possible. However, it is questionable whether the Ukrainian armed forces still have a sufficient number of suitable soldiers to use these weapon systems in view of the heavy losses in recent months. In any case, General Zaporozhye's testimony explains why the supply of weapons from the West does not enable Ukraine to achieve its military goals, but only to prolong the war. Russia could surpass Western escalation with its own at any time. In German discussions, these connections are not understood or ignored. The way in which some allies are trying to publicly urge the federal German government to deliver Leopard 2 main battle tanks also plays a role here. This has never happened before in NATO. In other words, Germany has never been pressured in this way. It shows how badly Germany's reputation in the alliance has suffered as a result of the weakening of the Bundeswehr, and with what commitment some allies are pursuing the goal of exposing Germany to Russia in particular. In other words, that there's an agenda which goes beyond Ukraine of destroying any possibility of a German-Russian rapprochement by getting Germany to supply tanks to Ukraine. And that is ultimately what a lot of this is all about. And he says that about all of these weapon systems, with the weapons promised to them at the next donor conference on the 20th of January, that is the one that's going on today, the Ukrainians might be able to defend themselves somewhat more effectively against the Russian offensive taking place in the coming weeks. However, you cannot reconquer the occupied territories by doing so. According to US Chief of Staff General Mark Milley, Ukraine has already achieved what it could achieve militarily. More is not possible. That is why diplomatic efforts should be started now to achieve a negotiated peace. Now, General Kuyat has a lot more to say along these sort of lines, and he says, for example, that arms shipments would achieve the opposite of victory. The war would be needlessly prolonged with more casualties on both sides, and the continued destruction of the country. And he seems skeptical about the talk of a stalemate and all sorts of other things. But anyway, that, it seems to me, is the kernel of his point. And I'm sure, again, he speaks for many people in the German military. We've seen General Vad saying the same, but the point that Kuyat is making is that these arms deliveries are not going to change the overall military picture. Peskov has said as much from the Russian side, and he's also said that they'll prolong the war, and one of their purposes appears to be to destroy any future possibility of the Germans and the Russians sorting out their issues and working together in the future, as they seemed about to do in the very recent past. So there we go. That is another view from another German general. Now, let me now return to the topic of these military deliveries, because one of the things that lends force to what General Kuyat is saying is that there is a huge amount of incoherence as to what the purpose of these armoured vehicle deliveries, the 100 tanks, if that is the number, the 100 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the 40 Marders, which are about the maximum that can be sent, the 90 Strikers, Striker wheeled vehicles, the AMX-10 wheeled tanks the French are delivering, the 18 Caesar howitzers the Denmark is sending. Apparently the total number, that's all of their self-propelled Caesar howitzers are now going to be sent to Ukraine. Well, anyway, what then is the purpose of all of this? And this is a question, of course, that General Kuyat asks. What is the West saying the purpose of all of these deliveries is? Well, I have read over the course of the last couple of days two entirely contradictory explanations. Explanation one is that Ukraine needs all these armoured vehicles in order to parry, to defend itself against the big Russian offensives which are coming. And perhaps General Kuyat, as we see, thinks that might to some extent help Ukraine. These weapons might help Ukraine, though it's far from certain that they will. But there is another view, and it's perhaps the more widely expressed one, which is that Ukraine needs all of these machines in order to break the alleged stalemate, in order to conduct its own offensive against the Russians. And General Kuyat says that's nonsense. It's going to be nowhere near enough. And, well, as you'll have gleaned from my programs, I think the same. So does pretty much everybody else that I give weight to, Colonel McGregor, Scott Ritter, Brian Baletic, all of these people, they all seem to think that these weapons deliveries are going to be nowhere close to being enough. But why in that case are they being sent at all? I mean, do they have any military purpose? Well, I've actually seen some other reports, and one of the most interesting one, and I can't remember where I saw it, but I suspect that this is true, is that the West has now given up any hope of trying to match Russia in terms of artillery concentrations. They've basically plundered all the artillery that they can safely transfer to Ukraine, these 18 Caesar howitzers, the 18 Paladin self-propelled guns. They're as much as can be sent. Ammunition, they're now running short of ammunition. There isn't really any prospect any longer of finding more artillery. And so, rather than simply give up on all of this, they're turning instead to armoured vehicles, because that's all they have now, in practical terms, which they can send. There was some talk over the last couple of days that the United States might provide Ukraine with a quantity, an undisclosed quantity of these combined missile bomb, rocket bomb missiles that has been suggested, I think, by Raytheon, or at least one of the US arms manufacturers. They've suggested that because of reductions in supplies of missiles and things, that the United States could combine these rather small bombs with rockets, that there's plentiful supply of both, that they could be mated together into a single weapon system with 160 kilometer range and supplied to Ukraine. Well, perhaps that's true. Perhaps that is a delivery which is pending, but there's been a publication of what is apparently going to be in the next US military package, and this particular system isn't included in it, or doesn't seem to be included in it, if this report is true. And of course, I'd heard other claims that it would only become available in any quantities. This particular type of new rocket would only become available in a few months' time. So it's not yet ready, even if the go-ahead has presumably already been given. And for what it's worth, I would add that the warhead of this rocket would be fairly small, and though it could certainly do some damage, it would probably not be the most powerful system that could be supplied to Ukraine. So anyway, so we have instead, apparently we can't provide them with long-range rockets. Supplies of ATACMS missiles are still off the agenda. Supplies of Abrams tanks are still off the agenda. So we're going to have to provide the Ukrainians with something. We can't provide them with artillery. We've looted our reserve of shells in Israel, which was there to provide the Pentagon and the Israeli military with the shells they might need in the event of a conflict in the Middle East. That's all been shipped to Ukraine as well now. So rather than accept that it's no longer possible to supply these weapon systems, and apparently there's even reports today that there's talk about trying to find Soviet-era weapons in Latin America, presumably places like Peru. Peru did obtain some Soviet weapons back in, I think it was the 70s. There might still be some there, for all I know. But anyway, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, apparently they've largely given up on that. So they're now scraping the bottom of the barrel, by supplying or bullying the Germans into supplying tanks. And this, in order to also complicate even further and into the indefinite future relations between Germany and Russia. And that's, it seems to me, where we are. There's also, I have to say, there's a sort of general atmosphere of panic and hysteria about the whole business. And the fact that there is still no willingness, public willingness, to admit that things are not going well for Ukraine on the battlefields. President Zelensky continues to pretend that Solidar has not fallen. There's no real discussion by US military about what's going on in Bakhmut, certainly not by the British military either. This latest offensive in Zaporozhye has gone unreported so far in the British media. But anyway, they must be aware that there's no stalemate in reality, that on the contrary, the reality is that the Russians are advancing. And I saw one report which said that the Pentagon had been caught by surprise by how dynamic the fighting has turned out to be this winter. They'd anticipated a long period of frozen battle lines, and instead the fighting has been dynamic. But of course, again, that doesn't concede, that doesn't admit to the reality that what's actually happening is that the Russian offensive in Donbass, and perhaps now in Zaporozhye, has been pressed home, that Siversk looks likely to fall very soon, that Bakhmut is now under severe pressure, that Solidar has already fallen, that the Ukrainians have been losing ground around Donetsk city. Well, one gets the sense that, as I said, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, looking for these weapons, for these armoured vehicles. And they've also, before things start to fall apart on the battlefields, all considerations of logistics, of maintenance, of training, of integration of weapon systems into combined arms warfare, what General Kuyat is talking about, well, all that's been thrown out of the window. You've got to send these tanks, these armoured vehicles to Ukraine in a great rush. Unclear whether, as I said, it's to repel a Russian offensive or alternatively to launch an offensive of one's own. It all looks very muddled and chaotic, and to be frank, hysterical. And at the same time, there is another factor that is now apparently causing growing alarm. We've just received reports that William Burns, the CIA director, has carried out some kind of secret trip to Kiev. Why was this trip kept secret? That's a very, very good question, by the way, because I don't know the answer to it. After all, US officials regularly and openly visit Kiev. Why was the fact that William Burns was visiting Kiev kept private, kept quiet, even though it's now been confirmed that he did in fact go there? Well, there are reports that Burns came along to reassure the Ukrainians that Western military support would continue, that the US would continue to provide some level of support this year. But he did apparently tell the Ukrainians that with the Republicans now in control of the House of Representatives, it was going to be increasingly difficult to push through further arms packages. And apparently he told the Ukrainians that the $45 billion package that was steamrolled through the old Congress would take the US, would provide enough funding for Ukraine to continue to, enough funding for Ukraine up to July. But it seems that there's uncertainty about what will happen beyond that point. So you send all these systems, all these tanks, all these armoured vehicles in nothing like sufficient numbers to the battlefronts. You can't come up with any coherent explanation of what they're supposed to do on the battlefield. And At the same time, you're doing it because the situation on the battlefields is deteriorating. Ukraine is losing ground. It's losing its major fortified line in Donbass is cracking. And at the same time, you fear that perhaps in a few months' time, unless you get all these weapon systems to Ukraine quickly, well, the funding will run out. I have to say, that's how it all looks to me at the moment. Or, as I say, very hysterical, very unclear, a lot of bullying of the Germans going on. But of course, they've put themselves in that position, not just because they didn't strengthen the Bundeswehr, as General Kuyat says, but because they foolishly went along with every sanctions and escalation demand that the Western powers, the other Western powers, have made of them. But anyway, that's where we are. Now, what happens if all of these arms deliveries fail to achieve their intended result? That we will have to wait and see. The Russians, as I've said, seem very calm about this. We've just seen what Peskov himself has to say. And in the meantime, the Russians are busy with their own things. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has been in Minsk. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has had a conversation with his opposite number in Belarus. Perhaps something important is going on there. The United States still talks about supplies of air defense systems to Ukraine being the priority, but at the moment it doesn't look as if there's very much left that can be supplied on that front. So, as I said, we come up with armoured vehicles. We can't match the Russians in artillery. We can't match the Russians in ammunition. The HIMARS system has done what it can, but it's running out of ammunition also. The Ukrainians use far too much of it. Javelins and Stingers, well, that didn't work out that well. That hasn't held the Russians back. So we turn to armour instead. The amount of armour that we can supply, all the experts say it's nowhere near enough. German generals are saying it. British officers are saying it. Even the Polish chief of staff, to my amazement, apparently is saying it. And yet, the political imperative means that it must be done. Well, I have to say, I've never known Western policy to be as chaotic and as misguided as this. And General Kuyat talks about the need for a negotiated settlement. But once more, we see that those who've proposed it, we've heard General Milley discuss it back before the Christmas holiday. We saw other officials talk about it, but whenever the subject is raised, we see that the hardliners respond and they invariably prevail. So we'll see where it all goes and what happens next. And obviously, in my next programme, I will be discussing whatever decision comes out of this meeting in Ramstein. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And have a very good day until then. And just to remind you once more, you can find all our videos on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also, of course, go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.